My name's Chris Lester. I'm going to talk to you about Grimsby Ice Factory, a little bit about its history, how it worked, what there is there today, and possible ideas for the future. I hope you find it interesting. Well, let's talk about why we're talking about it first. What is its significance? Well, locally, it was the enabling facility for the development of the world's greatest fishing fleet here in Grimsby. It was the plentiful supply of fresh crushed ice which enabled the fish to be stored for long periods at sea when the trawlers were going up to Icelandic waters and so on. Nationally, it's the only surviving industrial scale ice factory which still contains its equipment, and there is international interest for technical reasons and because it was the largest of its kind in the world. Now, refrigeration is one of the silent and unsung technologies of the modern world. Almost all the food that we eat has been in contact with the refrigerator at some time or other. I like to think that the ice factory put the great in Great Grimsby. Where is it? Well, this is a map of the docks. All of the, let me just turn my pointer on. All of this area was fish dock, and the ice factory is the two triangular buildings in this red circle here. So it was standing on the edge of the dock, so it was easy to provide ice for the trawlers. This is an aerial view of it. You can see it is an odd shape. This is because there was a railway line running up here and going along there and going out along that pontoon. So the original factory was built here, and when it was extended in 1907, they had to build it on the other side of the railway line, which is what this triangular building is doing here. Of course, the railway has long since gone. You can see that there were conveyors running out of the factory over the road, over the fish pontoon, to allow ice to be dropped straight into the fish pounds on the trawlers that were moored along here to fill up with ice. There was also a conveyor which ran along here, along this pontoon. At the end of that, there was a crusher, so they were sending blocks of ice along there. It was crushed at the end, and that meant they could bring trawlers along here as well to fill them up with ice before they went to sea. Bit of history now then. The Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway was marching its way across the country to its terminus at Grimsby, and it wanted a dock because they wanted access to the Baltic ports. So in 1845, they bought the existing dock, which was the Alexandra dock. By 1856, they had built the first purpose-built fish dock so that the fishing fleet didn't have to get in the way of the cargo activities in the Alexandra dock. And in order to supply ice for the trawlers, they were importing ice from Norway. This was quite common. A lot of Norwegian ice came to the UK. By 1895, they had to import 75,000 tons of ice because the fishing was flourishing. They'd landed 92,000 tons of fish that year. So in 1898, the Grimsby Ice Company was formed by two other companies that were supplying Norwegian ice, and they decided to build a big factory and produce the ice locally. Factory opened in 1901, producing 300 tons of ice per day, and by 1907 demand was already outstripping supply, and they built that extension which I've just referred to, and that increased capacity to 500 tons per day. But the fishing fleet continued to grow and demand grew exponentially. And by 1930, they decided they had to do something about it and bring in a completely new, much more efficient and modern plant capable of producing 1,100 tons a day. That meant transferring from steam engine driven compressors to electric motors, rather like you've got in your refrigerator at home. They continued to invest in the factory after the war, but certainly by 1970 there was a noticeable decline in demand for ice. This was due to the Cod Wars, the EU quotas coming in and so on, and the factory started running inefficiently to the extent that by 1990 it was closed. The demand for ice was very small and they just couldn't produce it economically. At the time of closure, it was spot listed grade 2 to protect it, and subsequently English Heritage upgraded that to grade 2 star, which puts it in the top few percent of listed buildings. This is just setting the scene now. Here's a postcard dated 1909, and it shows fish lying on the quay waiting to be auctioned, with the fishermen hanging around waiting to see how much money they were going to make from their catch. And probably some of these men were fish traders eyeing up fish they particularly had their eye on. So this was the sort of activity that was going on. Here's a wartime photograph, or two photos in fact, on board a trawler called the Righto. You can see a chute here with crushed ice dropping down into the holds of the trawler. And here the photographers went to sea on this vessel. And here you can see a fisherman stacking these huge cod in crushed ice down below decks. This was a wartime series of photographs produced to show life on the home front. You might notice that the three people in this are all quite elderly looking. This, of course, is because all the young men had gone to sea in their trawlers requisitioned by the Admiralty, and the reduced amount of fishing was mainly being done by retired fishermen who came back into the business. Ice was also required around the docks. The fish traders needed it to repack fish for onward transmission by rail, and other people used it as well. The usual way of carrying it around the docks were in these wooden barrels, which were made in the factory. There was a father and son team of coopers making and repairing wooden barrels, and they were carried around in these wonderful lorries. Well, this was all in aid of shipping fish out by rail once it had been caught. Fish would be packed in ice in these boxes and then put into insulated fish vans. This is about 1950, this van. And then they'd be swiftly carried to their destination, typically London, for instance. The railway saw the fish industry as a very important part of its cargo carrying activities. Well, how did it work then? Well, it's exactly the same as your refrigerator, only at home, only in a much bigger scale. So there are two distinct processes. There's refrigeration, which is creating the cold atmosphere in which you are going to freeze fresh water for making ice, which you do at home in little plastic ice trays. Well, it's exactly the same process on a much bigger scale at the Grimsby Ice Factory. This is a diagram of the electrically powered system, the system that is there still today. We start off with electric motor driven compressors that are compressing ammonia. Ammonia is a gas, and when you compress a gas, it gets hot. So the compressed gas comes out of the compressor and it goes through this de-superheater where some heat is extracted from it that's used later in the process for thawing the ice that's been made to get it out of the cans. And the hot gas then carries on through oil separators to clean out any oil that it's picked up from the compressors, because when this becomes cold, that oil will turn into jelly and bung up the works. and then it goes into these large condensers. There's a network of pipes in there. The gases run up and down these pipes, and seawater in large quantities is pumped through these condensers to cool it. Now, if you cool the gas enough, liquid comes out at the bottom and is collected in the two liquid receivers. You'll see all this later. Now, to create the cold atmosphere, this is all to do with the laws of thermodynamics. If you allow the liquid, it's under pressure, so you can allow it to expand gradually. It has to take heat out of its surroundings for that expansion to take place. It has to do it. It's all in the laws of thermodynamics. So the liquid is gradually expanded and run through a meandering network of pipes. And this is where the heat is taken out of its surroundings. In this case, we use brine, which has the property of freezing at a much lower temperature than water. So we can create a bath of extremely cold brine, and the ice is then made in cans in that brine. Now, in your fridge, you just have air in your ice box. This is a more efficient way of doing it. Rather messy, you couldn't really do it at home. The gas, once it's been expanded, is sent back to the compressor where it's compressed again and recirculated, and this goes on continuously. Well, in the early days, the 1901 equipment was made by Pontifex and Wood. We don't know much about them. Pontifex were a London company, and Wood were a Derby company, which they took over. We don't even know where this equipment was made. But what we do know is that it was steam operated. We don't know who made the steam engines. It was in the days when most engineering companies made their own. And they possibly made the boilers as well. We just don't know. We know a lot more about the 1907 extension because it was written up in a journal called The Engineer. It was made by the Linde British Refrigeration Company, which was a subsidiary of the German Linde company owned by Professor Linde, who was one of the great pioneers of refrigeration. And they were able to increase the output by 200 tons with their extra equipment in the extension. Now, I showed you how the ice cans were pushed through the cold brine to freeze them. They tweaked the process to increase the output, and by 1930 they were actually getting 730 tons a day from that setup, which was designed for 500 tons. By adjusting the speed that they pushed the cans through the brine, adjusting the temperature of the brine, and so on, they were able to increase the output. But it still wasn't enough, and we'll be talking shortly about the electrical installation they did after that. But first, there are a few photographs of the early days. This is the boiler house. You can see the row of boilers there. There are 6 altogether. Manually stoked, no automatic stokers on these. And you can just make out that is actually the corner of a railway wagon. So they were able to run a little siding into the boiler house from the railway line, which I talked about earlier, which ran along the edge of the original factory. So they could get the coal straight into where it was needed, which is good. Of course, the factory in those days had quite a big chimney. That's the boiler house next to it. We also had, in the extension, there was a conveyor running down there that was delivering blocks of ice out to the end of that pontoon, where it could be crushed and put straight into the trawlers, whereas the rest of the factory they crushed in the factory and then conveyed it out from there. This was the compressor room in those early days. These are the Pontifex compressors. Sadly, we don't know much about them, but they were double acting, so the pistons were going back and forth horizontally, and they were compressing gas in both directions of travel of the pistons. The white that you can see is frost on the pipe. So I explained how the gas was expanded and it took the heat out of its surroundings. Well, it hadn't clearly taken all the heat out of its surroundings when it was recirculated for compressing again. So it was taking the heat out of its surroundings here, and that meant frost appearing on the outside of the pipes because cold air won't hold as much water as hot air. And you can see, you get this on your fridge, especially if you leave the fridge door open. This is the 1907 steam engine, which was introduced for the extension. It was actually in the main building, and it was very cramped in there, so they couldn't get a camera in to photograph the compressors. But the engineer was renowned for its drawings in those days, and you can see here the two Linde compressors. Right then, by 1930, they had to do something about increasing production, and they decided to introduce electrically driven compressors with capacity of up to 1,100 tons per day. And the thing is, this had to be installed without disrupting production in the factory. That would have been disastrous to the fishing fleet. And they carried this out very successfully. The main equipment was designed and built by J&E Hall Limited of Dartford, with the electrical side provided by Metropolitan Vickers. I'll just let you have a look at this, some of the technical details for people who might be interested. When the system was first built, they used atmospherically cooled condensers, so they didn't have those big vertical tanks which I showed you in the diagram. They had a huge network of pipes, 17 miles of them, on the roof of the building. Now this is just like the network of pipes that you've got on the back of your refrigerator, which is cooling the warm gas, the refrigerant gas. The shell and tube condensers came after the war. Now, J&E Hall are a very interesting company. They were real pioneers in refrigeration. In particular, they pioneered the use of freezers on ships for freezing meat. They virtually invented the New Zealand frozen lamb trade. And you can see here the carcasses are being flash frozen, and then they're being stored in the hold. And this business was so important both to the company and to the shipping industry that the giant shipping company Cunard actually had one of their people on the board of J&E Hall's management team, because it was so important. They're still going today. They're now owned by a Japanese company. They still have premises in the UK, however. They're still using ammonia as a refrigerant, and they're still involved with the fishing industry as well. So there's a nice connection there. Well, what is there today? Well, a surprisingly large amount, but the factory is derelict and becoming rotten because of the vandalism and burglary that's taken place. The lead has been stripped from the roof, which has loosened the roof slates, which means the weather's getting in. In fact, now when the wind blows, the roof tends to lift up and down in places and it shakes the slates off, so it's rapidly getting worse. So although we've got a grade 2-star listed building, it's also on the Heritage at Risk register in the very bad category, category A. It's on the World Monument Fund's watch list. The Victorian Society voted it one of the top 10 endangered buildings in 2010. And in 2018, it was designated one of the 7 most endangered sites in Europe. And we know that the Europa Nostra people have been to the factory. We don't know what the outcome of all that has been. It's a relative of the European Bank. Nobody would say that this is a pretty building. This is the extension. and you can see it's got these massive blank walls, which the architect has tried to lighten a bit by putting in these artificial windows, but it's certainly not a pretty building. And of course it stands head and shoulders above the surrounding buildings, and you only have to travel over that elevated road to notice that. So of course a lot of people wanted pulling down because it's an eyesore, but of course if it was not an eyesore and it was performing a useful function, people were very proud to have it there. This is a plan of the ground floor as it is today. So down here we've got the modern compressor room. If you remember, they wanted the factory to continue running while the electrical system was put in. So they had to build an extension to accommodate the compressors. And this is where the boiler room was, and the steam engines were here. So they were retained so the factory could carry on production while the new system was installed. And they replaced the ice making tanks one by one where they had to, or certainly refurbish them. This is a pair of tanks. This is one, that's the other. So we had the rows of cans there which were filled with water at this end, and then they're pushed through the brine to the other end where the blocks of ice are removed. You'll see this in a minute. This is a cold room where they could store blocks of ice. The demand for ice was not always regular, not as regular as the factory could produce, so they always stored blocks of ice to accommodate peaks in demand. This is the extension, and it's got one very large ice tank in it. So we've got three here. On the upper story we've got four because there is another one here over the cold store. This is what the compressor room looked like in 1932 when the new factory, work was actually finished. It was all converted to electricity by this time. What it looked like a few years ago. You can see all the equipment is there. There are four compressors. You can't see the fourth one. That's a big electrical control panel there, and that is part of the main operator's panel. The grey is mainly pigeon droppings, and when I went round this about 7 or 8 years ago now, there was a family of foxes living in here. The smell of fox was unbelievable. There's the control panel where it was all run from. This was the last chief engineer, Mike Sanderson, who I did meet a few years ago. And you can see they've got their temperature gauges for the four compressors, all sorts of telltales to do with what's going on in the ice making tanks and so on. Now also here they would receive their instructions for how much ice they had to produce that day or that week. And they kept a log of the operating temperatures and any repairs that were needed and things like that. Here it is today. The electrical panel is still there, although it's been heavily vandalized, but you can see that there's enough there to actually cosmetically restore this. If this room with this fabulous equipment in was refurbished as a museum to show the ice making process, the cold creating side of it, you could do a cosmetic job on this quite easily. That, incidentally, is the corner of the wooden control desk. In fact, you can see that the vertical panel is still there, but it's lost its horizontal panel. Nice piece of wood for someone. Now these are the vertical shell and tube condensers that were shown in that diagram earlier on. So there's a lot of seawater running through these, cooling the gas, which turns liquid, and it collects in these two receivers here. And in the insets you can see what it superseded. These weren't put in until after the Second World War. Originally they extended the existing atmospheric condensers on the roof with the 17 miles of pipe, but I imagine they had problems with it leaking. This was a much more successful system to have here. This is one of the compressors. This is the fifth one that was put in the 1950s in case one of the others failed, although they were extremely reliable. One of the worries they had was that when they're recirculating the refrigerant, if any of it still actually remained in liquid form, if that liquid came back into a compressor, well, you may know that liquid doesn't compress. And with the inertia of this big flywheel and the pistons whizzing up and down, if it hit a patch of liquid refrigerant, it would probably blow the top off the cylinders. So it's very important to have safety interlocks, and you can see one of them here on the compressor. If you're going to make 1100 tons of ice, you're going to need 1100 tons of water. And the factory had its own boreholes, with three altogether. One of them was over 200 feet deep. The other two were a little less deep. And although this is standing right by the dock, they were accessing fresh water at that depth. And this is one of many freshwater pumps which was used to pump the water from the wells to the filling stations, which will become apparent shortly. We go. Here is one of the filling stations. Each tank had to have one of these, so there would have been 7 of these altogether. Here is a row of ice making cans sitting in the cold brine, or it would have been when it was working. An operator can turn a handle and lower all these nozzles down so that they can fill the cans with a measured amount of water. The cans were of 2 sizes. There were 200 weight ones and 250 weight ones. So the cans would be filled with water. They're sitting in this cold brine bath, and then the ram would push these forward and shuffle the whole lot forward to allow the last row of empty cans to be brought along by overhead crane and put in there. And so the process would continue. This is one of the empty tank rooms. Now, the problem with the listed building is that the listing includes the machinery inside it. But in this case, this tank had been stripped before the building was listed. So we've already got a big open space in there which could have a lot of uses. The timbers, by the way, are covers. When the tank was installed, it was completely covered with wooden planks to separate the cold brine from the atmosphere in the factory. Otherwise, it would be like leaving the fridge door open and you'd be trying to refrigerate a huge volume of air. This is one of the tanks. You can see the row of ice cans. There's a row been removed here, which is very helpful. What you can't see is these ice cans are actually slightly tapered at the bottom. They're narrower at the bottom than they are at the top. So when they've been dunked in the hot water of the thawing tank, the blocks of ice will easily come out when the whole row of them is tipped. This is in the tipping cradle at the end, and the blocks of ice will have dropped out of here many years ago, in fact. This is a posed photograph, but it gives you some idea of what was going on at the end. There probably only would have been 2 men working in here, but you can see the overhead crane, which has brought this long row of of cans, and tipped them on the tipping cradle, and the blocks of ice have dropped out. What the operators are doing is they're actually pushing them over to the right of this picture, and you'll see here, this is a conveyor. There's the remains of the rubber belt that would have run on these rollers, and the blocks of ice are then carried along to crushers. There's a crusher just there which I can show you. They actually designed and made these crushers themselves. Those are stainless steel spikes there which make short work of the huge blocks of ice which drop in here through this aperture or through that one there. Once the ice has been crushed, it can easily be handled with conventional materials handling equipment. So we've got here a typical grain elevator, and the crushed ice goes into these little buckets, and it can be carried up so that it can then be tipped down chutes to the waiting trawlers or to lorries to be loaded into the barrels. Here are the conveyors which carried the ice across to the trawlers. These have actually been taken down now because they were deemed to be unsafe, but they have been stored safely, so they could be reinstated at some point in the future. And you can see that there are also vertical chutes here which would allow any lorries brought in here to fill up with ice. Now here's a trawler being iced. This is the end of the conveyor number 3, and you can just make out in the eye of faith there, that white there is the crushed ice pouring off the end of the conveyor into this funnel and down this tube into the fish pounds on the trawler. I like this photograph because it reminds us how dangerous fishing was. This vessel's been in Icelandic waters for 3 weeks. It's come back. The crew have had a break ashore, probably only 24 hours, and they are now preparing to go to sea again. And during that time, the spray on the superstructure has not had time to melt. This is frozen spray from navigating rough seas in cold conditions. This is a winter photograph. And it is very important that you do not allow ice to build up on the superstructure of vessels because they can become quite top heavy. And there were instances in which, there were instances in which trawlers would roll heavily in rough seas and actually turn turtle and sink, usually carrying all hands with them. So men had to come out sometimes at night. The days were very short in Icelandic winters, with steam hose pipes and hammers, and chip the ice off the superstructure to make sure there wasn't too much weight because their lives depended upon it. And this would be in rough seas, rolling ship. It was very, very dangerous. That's what they did so that we could have our cotton chips. This is that cold storage room which I showed you on the floor diagram, and it's just like a big cabinet freezer. It's got the pipework running around the walls, which the cold refrigerant would be carried through to provide the cold atmosphere here to store blocks of ice which were not needed for crushing immediately. Now this is an illustration of what happens when you don't look after your roof. You can see this wooden floor is in a parlous condition, but I'm happy to say that most of the floors in the ice factory are steel and concrete. I think this is the only substantial wooden floor in the building. And despite the damage to the roof, the condition of the factory is relatively sound. This is the exception rather than the rule. Now let's talk a little bit about the people who worked there. About 150 people altogether when it was working at full production. And just like the process, it was divided into 2 departments, engineering and ice. And the engineering department ran the compressors, did all the maintenance and repairs that were required. And the ice men, the ice department men, would actually harvest the ice from the ice cans and handle the processing of it, the crushing of it, and delivery to the trawlers and so on. And there would also be a few delivery drivers driving around the port delivering ice to fish merchants and so on. Here's a picture of some staff. These are the joiners. Despite this, they're not the coopers. They were in the coopers workshop, but these were the joiners. They had to carry out wooden repairs. We've got the group of fitters here in the engineering department. This is the management team. I quite like this because if you look at the suit that this elderly gentleman is wearing and compare it with the suit of the young upstart, you can see we're in a period of great change in men's fashions in work, although at least they were all still wearing ties in those days. Mr. Roberts is included because it gives some idea of scale. This is the top of the compressors here, so you get an idea of how big they were. He wasn't actually an employee of the ice company. He worked for J&E Hall, and I found this out for the simple reason I did this talk in London, and his son was in the audience, and he suddenly stood up and said, "That's my dad." So we then established that he was a commissioning engineer from Halls, who was still on site when the photograph was taken. So one of the lorry drivers. They were quite a social bunch. They were united quite closely in their work, it seems. Now, not much paperwork has survived, but there are one or two logbooks. This is a logbook from the fitting department, and it's a list of the fitters by surname and the projects that they were working on. And if you look down this, you see that they're stripping number 2 elevator, all this team here, doing the major repairs that were needed. We've got down at the bottom here Bridges and Bridges Junior making ice kits. Over here, there's a list of the routine running repairs going on. And then a note here, Monday the 6th of May 1935, mechanics on holiday, Silver Jubilee, which is quite a nice thing to find. Now, the factory worked 2 shifts. There was a day shift when the icemen were harvesting ice and icing the ships and so on. And at night time, the system was slowed down. No ice was being harvested, so all of those rows of cans with fresh water in them would be stationary in the brine tank, and over the night that ice would freeze, that water would freeze into ice. So when the icemen came to work in the morning, they'd got a lot of ice to work at before they started drawing on the day's production of ice. It would take them several hours to shift all those rows of ice cans. At night, the site was staffed by a shift engineer and his assistant, and they would just maintain the plant running, carry out minor repairs, sweep the floors, switch lights off and things like that. They kept a log of everything, and they always logged the time they turned on different pumps and things like that. So if ever there was a problem with there not being enough ice in the morning, they could at least show they'd done their job properly. All sorts of other things noted in there. There isn't time to go into it in there. There's some interesting things. Just a reminder of where we are. We're down here at the bottom now in the red zone. The fishing industry started declining in the 1960s, and by the 1970s it was quite pronounced. So the demand for ice was dropping rapidly. And in the event, the factory closed in 1990. These are the only production records that survive. This is 1938, and you can see during the Second World War, demand was much reduced to the extent that one of the compressors was removed and supplied to a Middlesbrough chemicals company for use in the war effort. And of course, the fishing fleet wasn't going out very far because it was too dangerous. A lot of the trawlers had been requisitioned by the Admiralty, so the whole activity was much lower. After the war, there was considerable business in building new trawlers, and demand quickly got back to the high level. This region here is the 1100 tons a day that the factory was designed to produce, but you can see it slowly started declining and then faster and faster. Since I drew this chart, I found this extra figure for 1989, the year before it closed, 125 tons per day. Now that's about 10% of what the factory was designed to do. So it was operating very inefficiently at very high costs. Electricity was one of their biggest costs, and this log survives. They were recording all their meter readings per week, and from this they could work out how many units of electricity it took to produce a ton of ice. This is what they're doing here. And you can see this week, which is in 1987, they only made 525 tons in the week. And it's an absolute tragedy. There are other more modern ways of producing ice in that sort of quantity in a week, which did eventually take over from this. Flake ice is the process. Recent history then. In 1909, the Grimsby, Cleethorpes and District Civic Society arranged some public meetings to test public opinion as to whether the factory should be pulled down or whether the public really wanted it to survive. And the consensus was that it ought to survive because it was so important to Grimsby's history. So the trust was formed in the same year. And the council commissioned structural and conservation surveys so that we could better understand what the condition of the factory was and how important the machinery was. Various other activities took place, culminating in raising enough money to fund the options appraisal, which is working out what the factory can be used for. And in 2013, an application was made to the Heritage Lottery Fund. Little note about the Ice Factory Trust itself. I'd like to draw your attention to what it says at the bottom here. The whole point of this is that the uses for the ice factory have got to be sustainable. No point spending a lot of money on the building and then saddling the users of the building with huge mortgage costs. The idea was to get grants to cover the refurbishment of the building and then to let the contents of the building to various users, who I'll show you in a minute, and they would only have the future maintenance of the building to worry about. But it's got to be sustainable. It's got to earn its keep. While this was being done, one of our members started an oral history project called Project Ice, recording the memories of people who had connections with the ice factory. The outcomes of these were great because a lot of memories of life there were captured. A lot of new information came to light, and new photographs and books and documents and things. So it was a very useful exercise. This ice factory token turned up. This was a facility for small users of ice, such as shop owners who maybe had an ice store for ice cream or meat or something like that. They could go to the ice factory and buy these tokens for cash. They were a shilling each with a nice hole in them so you could put them on a nail in your office. And then when they wanted ice, they could just turn up and pay for it with the tokens, because it would not be attractive to either party to set up credit accounts. Some of you may remember the co-op milk tokens, which used to exist certainly where I lived. And you could you could buy a handful of tokens and then put a couple of tokens out in the morning, and that entitled you to 2 bottles of milk. A lot of problems associated with the ice factory. It is located in a working dock, so there are all sorts of security implications there. There's also a lot of legislation, both UK and EU legislation, regulating what goes on in docks and how things have to be protected. And there are the commercial considerations that the dock operators themselves, ABP, are running a business there. It's a listed building, so there are problems removing machinery to create space for other activities because the machinery is integral with the structure. And in any case, we must retain a complete picture of the ice making process, including that wonderful machine room. That has all got to stay, whatever happens. The condition of the building isn't good, and it urgently needs re-roofing to protect it. But that apart, it seems that the building is fairly sound structurally. I believe that there is a new structural survey underway at the moment. What the options appraisal did was look at what the building could be used for. It's no use for the port because this is a bulk handling port, so the storage facilities that could be provided would not be of much value at all because of the nature of the products. A lot of timber comes in through Grimsby, for instance, and you couldn't really store that in that building. These two applications, the hotel and retail applications, aren't viable because we would not be allowed to put a lot of windows in the building because it's grade 2 star listed. So that would be impractical. But the architects and the market research people came up with this idea of mixed cultural, commercial and leisure applications. And they costed this list of activities which could carry on in there. I won't go into all of this, but just point out the art gallery. There isn't an art gallery of international standing between London and Gateshead, and Grimsby is 20 minutes from an international airport, so it was considered to be quite viable to put in an art gallery in the building. The climbing wall is another one I should mention. The local climbing club have a long journey to go to a taxing climbing wall, and there is space in there. In fact, they produced a design very quickly for the climbing wall and their own little refreshment bar area and changing rooms and things like that. So these were in the proposal to the HLF, and you can see that quite a lot of jobs were envisaged from it. Well, the benefits should be obvious. The fact the building's being used, the public have access to it, creating jobs, attracting tourists for the refrigeration side of things, filling a gap in the cultural life of the area. And finally, of course, it is well known that when you regenerate a big building, there is a knock-on effect to the locality, both economically and socially. And certainly in the area where this stands, that would be a great benefit. Well, the Heritage Lottery bid was actually turned down in May 2014 because there were other demands on limited funds, and it was very big and complex. Now, we haven't actually put in another bid since then, but I have to tell you that the prospects at the moment are slightly better than they've been for a long time. Since Historic England designated a Heritage Action Zone in part of Grimsby, including the area in which the ice factory stands, and mainly the Casbah, which you'll be learning more about today. The Casbah itself is a conservation area, and of course the ice factory stands right next to it, so there may well be knock-on effect there as well. And money has come in from a number of sources. I'm only acknowledging one grant here, but money has come in towards a new condition survey and options appraisal. So prospects are probably better than they have been for many a year. The trust itself is part of the partnership which is restoring a historic fish smoking factory in the Casbah, which will have food related and cultural uses. It's all part of the Heritage Action Zone, which extends from the port down into other parts of Grimsby as well. It's a great project, and the prospects for Grimsby as a whole are probably better than they've been for a long time. Well, I've tried to show you a little bit about the history of the ice factory and what's there today and how it worked. I've had a lot of help, as you can see, and I've been doing this talk for some years, and some of the people on here have actually moved on now. But I am very grateful to the support which they have given me in preparing this. If you're interested in the technical side of it, there is a paper which was published in late 2014 describing the operation in more detail, and I could email you a copy of that if you're interested. Equally, if you've got any questions, do email me at chris@chrislester.com, and thank you very much indeed for watching.